Possibility thinking with a simple question of what if, and how do we apply this in our teaching, our parenting, our coaching, whatever work we're doing with young people, and also to our own lives, just kind of looking at how we can kind of explore this. So at this moment, these are some shameless plugs for my books, which my publishers always like me to do. We'll be drawing some ideas from Killing Ideas Softly, and earlier today I held a workshop with teachers, and we kind of tried to put some of these ideas, test them out a little bit in a little more extended format. This is going to be very similar to the concepts that we covered today and they worked on today. My new book coming out, Small Steps, Big Wins, is really where I'm drawing a lot of these ideas from, a framework for thinking about possibility thinking. And so one way to think about possibility thinking is, and the power of it that I really absolutely love, is the idea of moving from what is to what could or should be. I mean, I think that's a really powerful concept. And so it's part and parcel with the creative process. The creative process helps us move from what currently is to what could or should be. But first of all, we have to kind of imagine those different possibilities. And inviting our students into that space is kind of what possibility thinking is about. And so I'm building on the work of other scholars, like if you've read any of Maxine Green's work, Releasing the Imagination, or Anna Craft of the UK, she kind of coined the term possibility thinking. She recently passed away, unfortunately. So I'm standing on that work, and it also comes from John Dewey, who also recognized the absolutely critical need to engage in possibility thinking. So the thing that we face as educators, as parents, as people working with young people, I think one of the goals we can all agree on, because the goals are multiple in education, is what are we trying to do in this place called school? And I think one thing that most people can agree on is we're trying to prepare young people for the future, for their future, for the future of humanity. The problem with that is the future is highly uncertain. And in fact, the present is just shot through with uncertainty. So it kind of presents a paradox for us, that whenever we start thinking about the future and we face uncertainty, it's very uncomfortable for us. Uncertainty is not something we as humans really enjoy. And so when we are faced with this, one of our first moves is to try to erase it, to try to replace uncertainty with certainty. And especially in classroom settings, this is one of the things that we sometimes think about. Uncertainty for many of us signifies impending chaos. And so we're not too comfortable with uncertainty, largely because of our identities and roles as teachers that we've inherited. In fact, I work with prospective teachers. I started out as a classroom teacher in the early 90s, and then I became a teacher educator. I did a lot of teacher education work at the University of Oregon, and I continued that work at Connecticut. And what I find is a lot of teacher education programs prepare students to plan their lessons down literally to the last moment, right? So it's almost like they have every minute planned out. And that's a comfortable thing for a beginning teacher, to script kind of the lesson down to the last minute. But we all know, any of us that have taught, no matter how well planned the lesson is, when the lesson as planned meets the lesson as lived, there's always a rupture. Always uncertain moments, things you could never imagine happen. And so what I'd invite us to do tonight is, instead of try to erase those or see those as some sign of our own kind of incompetence, I think that's what practicing and prospective teachers sometimes inherit, is if I don't know where this lesson is going, I therefore am not, what kind of teacher would I be if I don't know what's going to happen next? And so what I'd invite us to say is, it's not a sign of curricular incompetence, it's a sign of life. Life is uncertain. And so can we take a moment and dwell within the uncertainty? Can we sit with that uncertainty and see, are there creative possibilities here? Are there opportunities or a need to try something new? Maybe the reason the lesson is planned doesn't work with the lesson is lived is because we need to set down the lesson plan. So these are things that I want us to kind of explore and think about in this space, especially as classroom teachers. And so, like I say, I've done this myself, but our students sometimes give us signs that Rome is burning, right? And we're holding to the lesson plan. And they're like, this is not working. And you can see it happening with your students, but we hold the lesson plan even more tightly. And, the Rome's burning, well, then we're going to burn together because I'm getting through this next slide in my PowerPoint stack, or we're getting through the next bullet point on my lesson. And so, again, I think we just want to remind ourselves that we wrote the lesson plan, we can set it down, right? Sometimes people inherit lesson plans, but it's this kind of focus on fixed ends that I think gets us in trouble and starts erasing our own ability to be creative and imaginative, and does the same for our students. I think the greatest barrier to creativity, there's a lot of constraints we face trying to be creative parents, teachers, and coaches, but I think the greatest barrier is ourselves. And part of it is because we are so focused on these fixed ends. And so this is an interesting little puzzle from visual psychology, and I realize, perceptual psychology, I realize it's somewhat difficult to see, but there's these little blue powdery dots. Can you see those? Yeah. All right, and so there's like fuchsia and yellow. All right, so this is meant to be an illustration. This is a static image. If you look at that tiny black dot, and imagine that that is the third objective that you want to get to at the end of this 45-minute lesson, right? Or this is item 4 on your agenda, or this is PowerPoint slide 15 that you need to cover today, all right? So stare at that dot. You're staring towards that fixed end. What do you see happening to those little powder-colored dots around? Just look at that for a few moments. They start disappearing. Those little powder-colored dots are a little kid's hand. I have an idea. It's gone, disappears. But what about this? What if we tried? Those possibilities literally disappear before our eyes. This is a cool little visual image from, like I said, perceptual psychology. That's not the point. The metaphor here is, I think, important. When we focus on these fixed ends, trying to get here, we miss the potentialities right before us with our classes, with ourselves. I mean, all of us that go into education, we don't go into education to be auditors, to keep track of things, to record things, to sign in, to sign out, to check all these lists. We go in for the possibilities because we love the subject matter. We want to engage in that. And so I want to try to invite us back into that space to kind of reclaim that creativity that we all have. So one thing we need to do is kind of loosen our grip on predetermined outcomes. This is one of the things I think that really gets in our way, is that we are so focused on delivering on these predetermined outcomes that we just pave over the possibilities. And so one way to kind of think about this is, when we get into this place called school, we kind of inherit this model of schooling, where if you watch little children play school and you listen to what they're doing, they're asking a very bizarre kind of question, a question that teachers ask all the time, known answer questions. Only in a place called school would that be socially acceptable to ask a question you already know the answer to. Luke, where should we go to dinner after this? Well, there's this great new place that opened up that has these wonderful fish tacos. Why don't you think about that some more, Luke? Can somebody else come up with an idea? I mean, we keep playing that until somebody guesses what I want to hear. Oh, the new sushi place. And it's like, well, why didn't you just tell us that in the first place? I mean, in any other social arrangement, that would just be, you would lose all the people around you. But in school, that's teacher talk, right? The teacher asks a known answer question. The student responds, not in a genuine way responding to this kind of provocation, but trying to match what the teacher expects and how the teacher expects it. Right? So this goes back to research from the 70s, the IRE pattern, where we learn, it's not necessarily taught explicitly, it's implicitly. I am the teacher, I'll ask a question, you raise your hand, you respond, and the way you respond and the way I evaluate that response is based on predetermined expectations. And to be successful in this place called school are kids who can match what's expected and how it's expected. The problem with that is kids that come from different social, cultural, historical backgrounds are already disadvantaged in that moment. Kids who share similar social, cultural, historical backgrounds with their teachers are already privileged in that fact because they can kind of put forth an answer that might match, that can fit what was expected. The beautiful thing about creativity is it requires difference. It doesn't just embrace difference, it necessitates it. Sameness does not work with creativity. And so difference is necessary. And so part of difference is being willing to explore that unexpected utterance that a child makes. That's one way to step into possibility thinking, to introduce that kind of unexpectedness, is to let go of the predetermined outcomes. let's see what happens if we follow this kid's idea. Now, that's easier said than done, as we will talk about in a moment. But I would argue that predetermined outcomes, something that we've kind of inherited, particularly in the era of high-stakes testing, has really undermined our possibility or our willingness to kind of explore teaching in a much more creative way and to engage in possibility thinking that could lead to even deeper learning, as I will hope to convince you by the end of this. But this is nothing new. John Dewey recognized that there's this paradox that we as parents, educators, want to prepare our students for these kind of futures, but he argued that it's impossible to tell what civilization will be 20 years from now, right? So it's impossible to prepare the child for any precise set of conditions. So we have this kind of paradox. You know, we're trying to prepare students for the future, but the future is unknowable. So what can we do? What he argued is we need to develop their capacity to deal with uncertainty. One way to do that is to kind of help them develop their own creative capacity, something they all have, and that we all have. And this little image up here is the Roman god Janus. And the cool thing about Janus is he simultaneously looks in opposing directions. And it's a reminder that he's an iconic image for some creativity researchers who say that creativity really is about creative combinations. It's like Janusian thinking. You're combining opposites. You're combining old and new, past and future. And so creativity requires this blending of sometimes extremely opposite things. Not only different things, but extremely opposite things. And so, again, the idea that if we're open to difference, if we're open to the unexpectedness that difference provides, then we can move into more creative spaces. Then we can move from what currently is to what could or should be. So schools, as we all know, though, privilege sameness. Again, right? We have the same age kids learning the same subject matter in the same way at the same time. So already that starts erasing creative possibilities for us. So how can we kind of disrupt that? One way is to think about creativity in this kind of formulation. If creativity is a blend, what is a blend of? And this is somewhat counterintuitive. Not all of us, when we think about creativity, think about it this way. But there's over 60 years of research, and creativity researchers generally agree on these two components. That creativity is this blend of originality. You absolutely need originality for creativity. But you also need to meet task constraints as defined within a particular social, cultural, historical context. So you can come up with a wildly original idea, but if it doesn't solve the problem, then it's original but not creative. Or you can meet task constraints, but if it's not original, then you're just meeting task constraints. It's not creative. The benefit we have as educators is we, over the past several decades, have gotten crystal clear on what the criteria or task constraints are. We're really good at that. So all we need to do, we're halfway there, all we need to do is create spaces for original expression to occur. Your originality, your students' originality. To open up how you meet task constraints in original ways. It doesn't mean you're throwing away criteria or constraints. In fact, you need them. You're just opening up an opportunity to meet those criteria in original ways. And by doing so, that's creativity. And so some of you are already doing this in the way you teach. You create moments of opportunity. So part of this talk, one goal is that you can recognize the creativity you already bring to the classroom, that your students already bring to the classroom, and name that, but also do it more systematically in how you plan and teach. Another way to think about this same formulation is a creative lesson then would be a lesson in which you blend academic content with students' perspectives, where students are blended in. I'm going to show you some concrete examples of this in a moment. But again, it's this blending of two seemingly opposite components. Or another way that I like to think about it is you're blending predetermined features, like there are certain things you need to learn about the narratives of, or the features of narrative story, or there's certain concepts you need to learn in mathematics. Those are predetermined. Those have been handed down through the curricula. But can we blend that with undetermined components, right? And so when you have a creative lesson, it's not like you're throwing away the content again. What you have there is a to-be-determined situation. So you know kids are going to learn fractions. At the outset, you just don't know exactly how that's going to be. But because you are a professional, and because you trust your students, and you can work together, these to-be-determined outcomes can emerge in a lesson that's created that meets the academic content standards or criteria, and also gives an opportunity for original expression. and they're advised creative. Again, I'm keeping it abstract right now. I'll make it very concrete in a few moments. Another way to think about this is when you're teaching an actual lesson, kind of doing this disciplined improvisational dance, if you will, kind of determining what things are fixed in this lesson, what are the things the students actually need to attend to and meet as part of demonstrating their creativity, and what things are flexible. So like when you're teaching a set of math problems, for example, what is fixed is the concept, or maybe the procedure even. What is flexible is maybe the example set. So maybe you invite your students into generating the examples. So what I would argue then is one of the greatest disservices to creativity in education is the slogan, think outside the box. Because creativity requires constraints. And so, especially in education, creativity is really about thinking creatively inside the constraints of the box. I think that's a really important and I think liberating thing for us to hear, is that creativity is about thriving within the constraints. So oftentimes, what we do in school is we have to meet those criterion constraints. Now that doesn't mean that there are times when we need to build a new box, right? That's a whole different kind of creativity. But for the vast majority of time, we need to decide on, okay, here are the constraints, here are the criteria that I am facing, my students are facing. Can we do this more creatively? So in my new book, I introduced these four principles of creative instructional leadership, creative teaching. They're essentially principles of the creative solving process, problem-solving process, that have been kind of worked on since the early 1920s, actually, and sometimes even before, and have gone through various iterations. So when you see creative problem-solving models or process models, there's sometimes 4 components, 8, 6, but these are principles. And the key about this is when you have a principle, when you understand a principle, like what does it mean to sit with uncertainty, then you can get away from looking for techniques. I think one of the things that we face as professional educators are there are a lot of people selling techniques, right? So instructional techniques. Why don't you try flipping your classroom? That's an instructional technique, all right? But there's principles underneath that would make sense or not, depending on your situation. So if you understand the principle, then you can develop your own tailor-made techniques. Sound? Problem? Should I just get it going? Yeah, I've moved too much. Sorry about that. Better? Okay, sorry. I apologize, everyone. So these are principles. So these principles you can shrink up, stretch down, elaborate on, and turn into your own techniques that make sense for your own classrooms. You can do this in a lesson, in an hour. You can do this across your entire curriculum. So the first one that we've been kind of talking about is sitting with uncertainty, the importance of doing that, and what that means. The second one then is, once you've sat with uncertainty, to engage in possibility thinking. And these are not necessarily linear stepwise. They kind of work in tandem with each other, all of these. And so engage in possibility thinking after you've sat with uncertainty, then knowing how to prune possibilities, how to do the difficult work of cutting away possibilities to pursue some, and then finally taking measured action. Taking action that makes sense, taking sensible risks, but actually doing something. You can have the greatest idea in the world, unless you take action on it, it can be meaningless. So let's unpack this first one, and we're going to spend a lot of time on sitting with uncertainty and engaging in possibility thinking, because it's kind of the theme of this particular talk. So when you're faced with an uncertain situation, our inclination is to run away from it, right? Uncertainty does not feel good. We want to get rid of that feeling. And so what I say by sit with uncertainty, what I'm appealing to is the Latin root of assessment, assare, which means to sit beside or sit with. We've again, in education, we've inherited this idea of assessment being testing kids. I mean, at least we have formative assessment now, but it's not that. Assessment literally means to sit with or beside. So when you're faced with uncertainty, can you sit with it? Do you have the courage to step into it? And I'm going to give you a couple concrete examples of what I mean. And I think if you are willing to do that, I'm sure many of you do and will continue to do so, you'll see wonderful creative possibilities that emerge that actually promote student learning as well. Again, we're worried though, because anyone that's taught, and the kid says or does something unexpected, we've all fallen down the curricular rabbit hole, where we followed a kid off on a tangent, and then 20 kids are looking at us like, are you going to continue having this dialogue with this one kid, or what about the rest of us, right? And so you've all been there, and that's not a good place for anybody to be in, right? what I would say is trust your professional expertise as a teacher to know when it's time to step out of that curricular rabbit hole. To say, okay, we're going to revisit this later with this individual student. But still step into the uncertainty. Because the thing about creative ideation in the classroom in particular, you cannot tell when it emerges whether there is a misunderstanding, whether the kid is willfully trying to disrupt your lesson, or whether there's something creative underneath it, or whether all three are at play. The only way to know is to sit with that, explore it, and see what's there. Then you can evaluate it. So let me give you an example. When I was in Australia in November presenting to some principals on this model of instructional leadership, I was talking about the importance of uncertainty and the importance of leaning into that uncertainty. And a principal came up to me afterwards and said, I have a really interesting example of this. We partnered with the local university to help us teach our human anatomy class, and so we were doing human body function. This is a high school class, human body functions and their systems. And we invited in this professor, and the professor, after they went through the various body systems, invited the students to kind of engage in a kind of partially indeterminate way, right? So they're talking about this, but anytime you invite students in, you're inviting in uncertainty. So they started out and they're like, so what if we got rid of some of the systems, like the circulatory system or a part of the body? What would happen to the rest of the system? So they're going along this path, and then this one kid raises his hand that the teacher absolutely didn't even want to be in the class during this time, let alone raising his hand. And so the kid, of course, delivered on that by saying, well, what happens if you remove the bum of a person? That's gone. Right? And so the teacher's inclination was almost to send the kid out of the room immediately. Right? And the kid actually, I'm being recorded, so I said it differently. The kid said it in a more kind of provocative way than that. Right? So the teacher was horrified. Here we have this guest here. I can't believe he's done this again. But the professor said, okay, look, we're just going to put some parameters around this. We're going to use scientific language, and we're going to explore what would happen if, in fact, that was gone. All right? What would happen? Do we have any analogies? Are there any animals that only have one orifice, for example? Right? And so they explored this, and one kid's like, well, a starfish. And so they started going, they had this little mini inquiry-based lesson. They went deep into the content and used this kid's ideas, and they all learned something, including the teacher, right? By exploring this, by leaning into and accepting the uncertainty. So that's an important component for us to remind ourselves, but also to help our students understand and meet task constraints. So let me give you a more personal example. My daughter, Olivia, who's in 4th grade now, is having a hell of a time in school. She's really struggling, and sometimes it's kind of interesting, and I feel at fault as a creativity researcher because I know some of the stuff I say sometimes comes out of her mouth in school, and that's not always a good thing. Other times, there's a genuine struggle. There's a genuine misunderstanding with kind of the game of school, if you will. So just to give you a couple examples, and I'll lead into this one. So for example, she was talking in one of her math classes in 3rd grade. They were talking about duration, right? And they were learning math, and so they learned so if Johnny starts reading a book at this time and ends at this time, how much total time he spends reading? And so then they were going to work on these worksheets. And so my daughter says, the teacher says, do anybody have any questions about time? So my daughter's like, where did all the time from yesterday go? Right? But that was seen as being disruptive because I think it's a very provocative question, and part of this is about having this conversation with my daughter about, okay, there's a time and a place for these questions, but yes, the teacher, because of the interaction she's had with my daughter before, saw that as being disruptive, right? Trying to stall and that kind of thing. But for my daughter, it felt like a dismissal, right? Because she really wanted to know that question. And she brought that question to me, and she thought like the teacher dismissed her on that question. Now, she also did other things that led up to that. So I will own this one. So she was caught passing notes around the class, right? And the teacher intercepted the notes, and my daughter had written, I'm sick and tired of working in this worksheet factory. All right, I take that one, right? So that's an antecedent to how she was approached, probably with a very kind of profound temporal philosophical question. Nonetheless, again, I think what we need to remind ourselves in those moments, because we have so many kids to work with, there's so much happening, that to try to be present. I think that's why that little dot with the dots around it, when my daughter says, where does time go? I think we have to remind ourselves to be present right here with that child. And part of teaching kids to be creative is teaching them when to be creative, or the risks involved. Teaching them that to be creative means to be creative within the task constraints as well. So how you respond to that kid's question matters, right? It's still okay to say, this is not the time to talk. You know, we're not holding a philosophical seminar right now. We do have some worksheets to get through. But you can do that in a way that's still supportive, like, what a great question, right? So the kid receives it differently and isn't stifled. So my daughter wouldn't raise another question in that class during math time, and started internalizing the idea, I'm a bad student in math, I'm bad at math, I'm a bad kid. All right, so fast forward to this. So she's in this that kind of environment. It was very, she described it as a bowl of porridge from Goldilocks. She described it as the cold porridge, that school where she was kind of dismissed, where the expectations became pretty clear to her, but the porridge they were serving was cold and didn't taste very good, and she didn't want to eat any of it. All right, so we started shopping for new schools. She's in her 4th school right now. It's been a nightmare. It's been heartbreaking and humbling to me. So the next school we went to, we searched schools around, and we found this Montessori school. And so the Montessori school, part of what they said is, you know, we have all kinds of learning materials here. You work with multi-age kids. You can use learning materials any way you want to support your learning. My daughter's like, are you serious? She's like, yes, we're serious. So we enroll her in this school, very expensive school. And the people really there are lovely. They really are. So about 2 weeks into that school, my daughter's like, Daddy, this place is just school. I'm like, what do you mean it's school? And so we go back to the Goldilocks porridge analogy. I'm like, so tell me in relation to the porridges. She's like, this porridge is too hot. I don't know what they want, right? They're really nice people, but this porridge is too, I keep getting in trouble because I don't know what they want. All right, a couple days later, I get a call from the learning director of the school that my daughter had destroyed school property. I'm like, oh, great. And that she was being kind of disrespectful and talking back about it. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I have to come from work. I have this conversation. These are Montessori counting beads. All right, so they use them in math. And this particular school, these brilliantly beautiful set from like Brazil. All right, expensive counting beads. So these are little beads on these little wires. So my daughter was bending them and turning them into rainbows and wanting to glue them on this piece of paper to make this artwork, right? So the teacher's like, what are you doing? You're destroying our counting beads. And my daughter's like, I thought you said I can use these beads however I wanted. Use learning materials any way I want. And they're like, no, those are for math. But she's like, but you said when I signed up here, I can use these any way I want. Except for this way, right? So again, it's another one of those moments. I totally get the school's concern about that. I totally understand that. But again, in that moment, those are defining moments. How the kids receive that kind of experience is really important and can accrue over time and create big problems for children with respect to creativity and their willingness to express it. So I just absolutely love this quote from Miles Davis. And if we take jazz out and replace it with learning, I think it's really beautiful. That if we can remind ourselves and help our children understand this as well, that there are no wrong notes in jazz, only notes in the wrong places. I mean, I think that's really beautiful, which creates a responsibility on the jazz player, right? Or the ensemble to try to figure out how can we get this note to fit. So if a kid does something unexpected in this context, can we support them in finding a context and where that works, right? To learn the task constraints. And so you all have students that you work with who are highly original, but they can't meet the task constraints. They're doing their own thing. So my daughter's kind of like that. She does her own thing. And part of what we need to do is teach her how to be herself, but still meet the expectations in this time and place. There are other kids who are excellent at meeting task constraints, and that's why they're successful students, and they won't take the risk to be original. You can say, you can choose any topic you want to write on. Well, what one should I write on? I mean, we all have those students, right? So part of our work, I think, as parents, teachers, and coaches, is to kind of nudge the kids that can meet task constraints to try to put their own twist on it. And then try to structure and support the kids that are really great at just kind of bringing their own world to that space and moving them towards the task constraints to help them understand that's what creativity really means. Right now you're just being original, but can we connect that? So here's an example of a school district that I'm working with that's outside of Fresno. One of the high school teachers has a student, and he was doing this creative project where he's turning the Odyssey into a comic book, essentially. And so this kid, loves these kind of images and so on, and came up with this really great image. And so he has the original part down, but this is supposed to be like a text-dense comic book. He writes, "Cyclops guy almost kills them." Right? And so the teacher is able to provide the feedback, knows how to nudge this kid. So this is an example of a teacher who has a good relationship with a kid, and this is what the nudging looks like. The teacher writes in the margin, because this is in Google Docs, "Come on, man." Right? That's the feedback he gives this kid. And then the kid produces rich text. All right? And so it's this kind of thing. Sometimes we need to be reminded, okay, bring it back to the text. Sometimes we need to be reminded, put your own twist on it. And it's that blend that leads to creativity and creative learning. The thing about creativity and learning is they are inextricably connected. Some theorists have argued that creativity and learning are the same phenomenon. And I think there's something to that. Learning, regardless of the way you think about it, regardless of the way it's been theorized, all learning is fundamentally about change. Behavior is called a change in behavior. It could be a change in cognition, a change in attitude, change in belief. It's all about change. Creativity is what drives change. It's what helps you move from what is to what could be. So these two things work in tandem with each other. And so if we can blend these together, not only are we going to get more creative and surprising expression, but we'll get deeper learning. So here's another example of a kid, there's the math problem, and the kid writes a poem. So again, it's how we respond to the child that matters. We might say, that's an interesting poem. I want to know, can you do math? But let's not give up on the poem. Let's save it for language arts. Or let me connect you with the language arts teacher. One of my favorite examples of this is, my colleagues and I talk about accomplished creators know when to be creative and when not to be. So my favorite example is when I was flying over here from Connecticut. It was a routine flight. The last thing, and I'm flying out tonight on a red eye, the last thing I'll want to hear tonight, too, is on a routine flight, the pilot coming over saying, "Oh, yeah, it's a routine flight. We have about another hour left. But there's a nice body of water there. I was thinking about this creative water landing. I think I might break it out." Absolutely not. You would not want that to happen. But if the plane was going down over a body of water, then by all means, pull out all the creative stops. Do whatever it takes. So there are risks involved. There are contexts. There's a time and a place. And I think that's one of the most powerful things we could teach kids and still support their creativity. Be original within the constraints of the particular task and context. All right, so let's talk about briefly a moment the cost of not knowing how to provide feedback to young people. I really believe that learning and identity are another thing that are inextricably connected. And so one of my graduate students and I are working on this kind of developmental model of creative identity development. And the idea here is, in school, kids get introduced, and outside of school, get introduced to all these domains where they could be creative. So anything that's a human endeavor has a chance you could be creative in. So you could be creative in a variety of domains, because creativity is a human trait. So imagine a kid gets exposed to poetry and says, "You know what, I like poetry." They like it, it's kind of a triggered interest, but over time, that like can grow into an aspirational commitment. I want to become a poet. So they're moving along, and now it's becoming part of who they are. I would say this is a critical time, a vulnerable time for a lot of young people. Right? So they've moved from liking something to saying, okay, I want to be this. They have not yet arrived through deliberate practice and expertise at saying, I am a published poet. Right? So they're in this window of time. And I can kind of share a personal experience of this. When I was 16, my father passed away, and then my grandfather passed away really shortly afterwards. And so for whatever reason, I started writing poetry. I had no idea why. But for some way, somehow, it allowed me to scratch meaning out of this kind of existential crevasse I'd fallen into. And I was getting support. I had a great high school English teacher. She gave me support. She was really supportive of my writing. Some of my college professors were really supportive of my writing. And then there was a published poet who I really admired at my university. And he wanted to see my writing. He saw one poem. He loved it. He's like, show me everything. So I gave him this pack of poems. And he basically said, this is crap. You're no John Keats. Who was my favorite poet? Right? At that moment, I sat down the pen and never picked it up again. Now, have you ever experienced that? Do you know anyone who has? Somebody who wants to be a dancer, they get one piece of feedback. They have one negative performance outcome, and they hang up the shoes and never pick them up again. They wanted to be a scientist. This happened on this test. This interaction in class happened. I mean, these things I talk about killing ideas softly. That's these kind of soft dismissals that accrue over time. This is something different. I call this creative mortification. In this moment, what happens is not that creativity dies, because creativity cannot die. As long as there's life, there's creativity. What dies in this moment is your willingness to pursue that creative aspiration. So the question is, as I started exploring this empirically, started doing research on it, I found out that people have had these experiences, and some of them are motivated by this experience. So one kid in gymnastics might say, who cares how big my torso is, I'm going to get on that gymnastics team and I'm going to get a scholarship. And they do, right? Whereas a kid in a similar situation hearing the same thing might say, I'm not going to do gymnastics anymore. So what's the difference? So what I found in my research is there's two key factors, and I realize that this district's working with some of Carol Dweck's work as well. So one factor is kind of a fixed mindset, essentially, with respect to that particular domain. So if the feedback, for whatever reason, reinforces the idea that you can no longer get better at being a poet, like I heard, you're no John Keats, right? I internalize that as, I will never be a published poet, okay? So there's that, but here's the other very powerful second component that predicts creative mortification: the experience of shame. Very painful experience. The experience that you literally want to disappear in that moment. So what ends up happening is these two things work together. So people always ask me, well, why don't you just start writing again? Because when I pick up the pen, it's too painful. And I feel like it's an exercise in futility. I can't get published anyway. Why put forth the pain? Why put forth the hurt? Now the difference is people that experience this as a motivating event, the key factor is they believe that improvement's possible. And they feel like they were wronged by that feedback. And so they have a desire to prove that person wrong, to confront them, right? So to prove them wrong. So I think it's an interesting thing that creative mortification often happens from well-intended coaches, parents, teachers, sometimes even peers. And I think it's something that we have to be on the lookout for, that we want to provide honest feedback, because it's just as devastating, as American Idol is starting to wrap up, it's just as devastating. We've seen in those early audition tapes, somebody that was always told, you have the voice of an angel, you have the voice of an angel, and then they go before the judges and they get eviscerated. That's equally devastating, right? And one of my other colleagues is exploring that. But what I want us to think about is, how can we provide honest feedback, right? Real world feedback that says, you're not here yet, but here's how you can get there, right? So it has to be honest. And part of that is being supportive and helping them understand that there are certain task constraints that need to be met. So I'm just going to close with a couple things of how we can intentionally introduce uncertainty, and then I'll open it up for questions. So I'm going to try to end my portion in the next 15 or 20 minutes. We'll open up to questions and comments, and then we'll just go into that good night. Sound good? So I doubt we'll go until 6:30. All right, so how do we introduce uncertainty intentionally? So what I've been talking about so far, and part of what my model talks about is knowing when to be creative, is when you're faced with something and you don't know how to handle it, right? That's the time to be creative. When you've tried everything else, when you have this lesson and activity, it always works every year with every kid, but it's not working with this group of 9th graders. That's the time to rethink that, to be creative. there's other ways of doing that is you can intentionally introduce uncertainty to promote creativity. And so that's what I want to talk about briefly. So again, we know creativity is blending student perspective and academic content. Here's just a couple quick, very concrete examples. Let's say you are going to teach these kind of 4 components of narrative: setting, conflict, main character, point of view. So let's say these are part of your standards that you have to teach. Okay, one thing we sometimes do as teachers is too much of the work. So we're like, we have to teach those 4. I'm going to generate a bunch of examples. The kids can draw from them, and then they'll write these stories. There's this great cartoon I remember from this early teaching and education book that shows this teacher just exhausted, dragging out of school, and it says the person who's the most exhausted out of the day has worked the hardest. Are you working hard, or are you working harder than your students? If so, you're doing more learning than them. So the idea here is, what if we set up the criteria like, okay, you need to learn these 4 components, and you explain what those are, and then you simply invite students into providing the example set. Right, so you just say, give me 5 different settings, and you write them on the board. Give me a bunch of conflicts. Okay, zombie apocalypse, great. All right, give me some main characters, give me some points of view. And then you have kids roll dice or pick randomly, and now they write a story that's set in Florida. It's a zombie apocalypse. It's the teachers are the main characters. It's written in 3rd person, and they're off. And then they share their stories out. So in this case, you're introducing to be determined uncertainty in there. You know they're going to hit those 4 criteria. That's the task constraints. And if they're drifting away from that, you bring them back to that. But what you allow for is them to generate possibilities here and possibilities in their writing, and you have no idea what they're going to come up with. And when you do that, when you trust yourself as an expert and you trust your students, you can be surprised at the results, even in something as simple as this. Here's another example. This is from a teacher in China who teaches creatively. This is a 3rd grade word problem from China. It's a standard word problem. The task constraint is you have to provide an accurate solution to this problem. This tiny little move she made that makes this a creative opportunity is she also required, not just invited, required that students come up with as many different ways to solve the problem as possible. Okay, so imagine this playing out in your classroom. Let's say you're teaching math. Right, so you might have a kid that can't solve this problem at all, okay? You might have a kid that can provide 1 solution. You might have a kid that can provide 6 solutions, right? And so this teacher, her kids generate over a dozen different solutions, multiple solutions. And so then the next step is to share those out. So I'm the kid that has no solutions, and now I see 18 different solutions. I came up with 4, now there's 14 more. And so what this does, and this is where my kind of claim that creativity and learning go hand in hand, I think it's an empirically testable question. What's more powerful for a learner? To assign 18 different word problems, having them solve it in the one way we taught them, or assign 1 word problem and have them explore it 18 different ways? All right, I think that's worth exploring in your classroom. That's deep learning that can emerge from that kind of thing. And it's a very simple move. We're just inviting kind of ideational fluency there. So here's another example. One of my doctoral students at the University of Oregon, he came up with this project. He was working with a 4th grade teacher, and the 4th grade teacher said, the real F word in 4th grade is fractions, right? Nobody wants to hear it, not including me. All right, so he worked in this project that he could bring in community members and so on, but you could do this with students. And so here's a way you could do this. Let's say you have to teach the concept of ratio. All right? And so what you do is you're going to say, we're going to learn about ratio, but before we do, let's just invite some conversation. What things are you interested in? So some kids might say, I want to be a hairstylist. So my daughter wants to be a hair salonist who has a YouTube channel and focuses on American Girl dolls. It's this combination. It's very interesting. Anyway, so you have, maybe she says that. You're like, okay. And then there's another kid like, I love Minecraft. Great. So do I. So there's 4 of you like Minecraft. So you're writing all these on the board, right? And then you have kids like, I love to bake. So you have baking. So you have all these things. And then you do this, this conceptual combination, right? This Janusian thinking. You say, okay, let's take hairstyle and ratio and smash it together. Can you come up with a ratio that has something to do with hairstyles? Can you take Minecraft and ratio and smash it together? And so there's actually lessons on the internet of this kind of mullet math lesson. It is a ratio. And I love this because when I was in high school in the 80s, I had a magnificent mullet. I really did. I apologize for that visual image. But so this is a ratio. So the kids could come up with a ratio for how much business in front versus party in back to constitute a mullet. And now you could classify hairstyles. You could say, you're almost there with the mullet, you need to kind of shorten the top of your hair, or you need to grow out the back. So there is a proportion to it, right? And you could do the same thing about baking, you could do the same thing about Minecraft structures, but the cool thing about it is kids are putting their interest into it, and then they have to share it out. They have to exhibit that. And so once again, we're learning mullet, or not mullets, we are learning mullets, we are learning ratio with all these different representations, including mullets, including Minecraft, including baking, or whatever these different things that kids care about are there. Simple little moves, right? This is working creatively inside the box. It's not really pushing the box out in the world, but it still breathes new life into it, and it's a wonderful thing that the kids that can come up with. So that's kind of sitting with uncertainty, engaging in possibility thinking. When we're engaging in possibility thinking, so you're facing this uncertainty, we already sort of saw that with inviting students into it, just kind of flipping your assumptions, bringing them into it, generating new possibilities to think what is, what could be. And one of the ways to do this is to flip your assumptions. The thing that kind of gets in our way of thinking new ways, from moving from what is to what could be, is our assumptions, which are untested beliefs. And so I have, these really cheesy puzzles. I'll just share one just to illustrate what I mean. All right, so these are called lateral thinking puzzles, and the whole premise behind these is the only reason why you don't see the solution immediately is because you're holding on to your assumptions. The minute you test your assumption, which is an untested belief, all of a sudden you will come to the solution. It'll just hit you over the head, and they are so cheesy that you'll be like, of course, that's ridiculous, but let's try one. All right, because I think it's a pretty powerful example. So here's how this works. Imagine yourself in front of this villa, and before you is this palatial hut. So you walk in the palatial hut, and dead on the ground are Antony and Cleopatra. Next to the two dead bodies is a broken bowl with some fluid spilled on the ground. No one was in the villa when they died. What happened? So I'm going to invite you to ask me yes or no questions, challenging your assumptions. So what are you assuming about this puzzle? Ask those questions. If you know this puzzle or you have a moment of insight, just please wait for it. Let us struggle with being stuck in the assumptions. Okay. And kids, by the way, can get through these quickly. So lateral thinking. You have to kind of step aside and ask these questions. So again, I'll give it to you one more time. You enter this villa. In front of you is this palatial hut, dead on the ground, Antony and Cleopatra. Next to the dead bodies, a broken bowl with a little fluid spilled on the floor. No one was in the villa when they died. What happened? So just ask them yes or no questions, and we'll come to a solution to that question. Yes?
Was the bull involved in their death?
Was the bull involved in their death? Great question. Yes.
Are they wounded?
Are they wounded? No, but they are dead. Is the fluid poisonous? No. These are good questions.
Did they ingest the fluid?
Did they ingest the fluid? No.
Were they bleeding?
Were they bleeding? No. Good question. Yep.
Is there anything else in the palatial hut?
Is there anything else in the palatial hut? Not at the moment, no. I mean, it's palatial. I guess there's beautiful paint. I'm spinning my wheels. But keep going. Good question. I would say no. Yes?
Was anybody else involved?
Was anybody else involved? No. Good question.
It's kind of related to my question. Are Antony and Cleopatra's bodies?
So say that again?
You said that Antony and Cleopatra.
Yeah. The two bodies are Antony and Cleopatra.
Okay.
Are these historical Antony and Cleopatra?
Oh, good question. That's a question challenging a fundamental assumption. No, they are not historical Antony and Cleopatra. Now we're getting there. Do they have what?
Gills?
Do they have gills? Yes, they have gills. So that's a roundabout way of asking, are Antony and Cleopatra human? Probably what you were assuming. No, they are not. They have gills. They're not like aqua people. They are fish. So what happened? This fishbowl falls off. Maybe the cat knocked it off. Somebody else wasn't there, but something was and killed them to their untimely flopping death on the ground. All right, so. But the point is, the thing that stuck you in that puzzle, and these are called lateral thinking puzzles. You can probably find them online. They're great. I used to use them in my class all the time. But for our purposes, the point is the assumption, if you don't let go of that assumption or even challenge that assumption that they're human or not, you would never solve that problem. So by asking those kinds of questions, fundamental questions that we take for granted, that's when we can move to new solutions. And I think we inherit a lot of these in school, fundamental assumptions like that. Okay, so that's the Anthony and Cleopatra one to illustrate the assumptions, to challenge your assumptions. So I'll give you another kind of personal story of this. Sometimes what we do as well-intended parents, teachers, and coaches, again, is we think we know, we assume we know what's best for young people. All right, so let's go back in time. I grew up in Wyoming, and so I apologize if you're not a Bronco fan, but I will not apologize for the Broncos this year because they're Super Bowl champions. Anyway, so I grew up a Bronco fan because I lived in Wyoming. That was the only professional team anywhere in hundreds of miles. All right, so when I was in like second grade, there was this Nerf football league that kind of emerged on the playground. And I liked it. I started playing the Nerf football league. And there was like an older kid, like a third or fourth grader, who was like the commissioner of the league, who basically said, like, you all can play this after the holiday break only if you wear one of these. And he was wearing an NFL jacket. He said it could be any team you want, but it has to be NFL. This is legit. We're doing NFL Nerf football out here, right? So I realized that my family did not have a lot of money, but there were a lot of them. I come from immigrant Italian families, so there were a lot of them. And I kept asking all of them, like, they would say, what do you want for Christmas? I would say, and I had the Sears catalog. I'm like, I want this Denver Bronco jacket right here. And I would show them all, and they're like, are you sure? A jacket? You don't want toys? You want Rock'em Sock'em Robot? No, I want this. This is what I want and need, okay? So fast forward to Christmas morning. I have this box. I know it's clothes. I'm super excited about it. Only time I was ever excited about clothes from my family, as you'll see why. And so I tear open the box, and that's what's in there. This black fur coat and black fur hat. I'm like, what? And my aunt, who's the patriarch of the family, stands up and is like, Ronnie, you want a coat? We buy you the best coat money can buy. Get Bella, Ronnie. I'm like, what? I knew then I was in big trouble, but didn't have the ego strength to like go out and say, no, I'm not wearing this. So I roll onto the playground with this, fur coat on, and the kids are like, no, Commissioner, you cannot play football in that, right? And so that was the last day I played Nerf football on the playground. Now, the takeaway lesson, aside from this humorous, painful story, is that we sometimes assume that we know what's best for kids without really testing that assumption out, right? Without really listening to what they have to say. And so a fundamental assumption, that we don't test can lead to these kinds of problems that can interfere with learning or interfere with students' willingness to share their ideas. Here's another example that I think is really interesting. When we're facing a problem and we're faced with the uncertainty of a problem, one of the things that testing assumptions can do is help reveal what's really the problem. So something that seems like a problem we're putting a lot of energy towards, there might be another problem that we haven't even thought of. So creative problem solvers talk about problem finding as being the most important phase in the creative process. A lot of them argue that for this very reason. So many of you probably use the popsicle stick calling process in your class. Does anybody do that? Okay. So this is a great little technique. This is a technique that was used to disrupt the frequent flyers in the class who are always raising their hand. There's always like 3, 4, 5 kids that are the only ones, and nobody else raised their hand. And I think we can kind of step out of this talk for a second and think, what even governs your hand-raising behavior in spaces like this? When do you raise your hand and when do you not raise your hand? And where did you learn that, right? There's rules to this game. And it probably has something to do with, I only raise my hand when I know what's expected and how it's expected, or that I can contribute. It goes back to school, but just think about it. We'll set that aside. All right, so this teacher, and it's interesting, one of the progenitors of this technique who talks about formative assessment, he's out of the UK, Dylan William, he went to a UK school to kind of look at participation in lecture, and so they started implementing this technique in this school. All right? So in the classroom, like other classrooms, about 4 or 5 kids would always raise their hands, so they do the popsicle stick thing. And so the popsicle stick thing's working, but then the teachers noticed something bizarre about the popsicle stick thing. Those kids that were always raising their hand are never getting called on. Some of them are never getting, now this defies statistics and physics because you draw the sticks out until there's a stick in there, you're going to get called on eventually. These kids were never getting called on. So the teachers realized the stick is not in the bucket anymore. And so the researchers approached these kids and asked, where is your popsicle stick? And one kid admitted, I stole it and took it home. It's in my bedroom. Now, the question is, what? This is a kid who always participated in class and has stolen her stick and brought it home. Why would somebody do that? What's going on there? What problem does that suggest? The popsicle stick was trying to solve one problem. This reveals another kind of problem. But think about that. What do you think, and I'm playing intellectual hide and seek with you right now because I know the answer. What do you think the kid said in that space? You want to venture a guess? Think about that for a second. Why would a kid do that? A kid who always used to raise her hand, steal her stick, and bring it home so she never got called on.
Just like out of fear that if her stick was chosen.
So the comment is, out of fear that if her stick was chosen on a topic or question that she didn't know, it would be too devastating. And that's essentially what this kid said. That I always knew the answer. What would happen if I got called on and I didn't? So even though the kids would seem to raise their hand all the time, they still have the autonomy to, like, I'm not going to raise my hand this time. And amongst the four of us, we could probably field any question in this class, right? So it looks like you're always raising the hand. But what would it do? So again, identity, it's too risky to share an idea. So what that suggests to me is the problem that this technique was trying to solve is not a problem that can be solved by a technique. You have to understand the principle of what's happening in there. The principle is, can you create a classroom environment that it's safe enough for everyone to share their ideas, even the frequent flyers who seem to always share their ideas, to take those risks to be wrong? Right? How do you build that space in your classroom? No technique is going to get you there. That's kind of people work, relational work that you have to do, trust building work that you have to do with young people in your classroom. So these kinds of things I think are always interesting to me because it helps us think about flipping our assumptions and moving from uncertainty to start identifying problems and then start generating possibilities. And once we do that, the next stage is to prune possibilities. So we'll kind of close out on this with just a couple quick examples. So once you've kind of engaged in it, you have identified a problem, you start generating possibilities. At some time, you have to prune the garden, if you will, of possibilities. So there's a couple of things that I think are important to think about in this. This is really difficult work. Anyone that's ever written something or maybe if you have a favorite instructional technique and it's not working this year, you have to have the courage to cut it away and let it go and say, I'm just not going to do it. It's not working. Or I love this turn of phrase in this thing I've written, but I'm just going to have to cut it away. Right? That's difficult work to do. But there's creative possibilities in even pruning possibilities. And so I think we can learn from Picasso. It's one of the most, I think, brilliant examples of the power of pruning possibilities. So these are two slides from Picasso's Bowl series. So there were multiple lithographs that he produced. And so I have up here the first one and the last one. Now as you look at that, many of us, when I first saw this, I would say the first bowl in Picasso's series is the bowl on our left. Right? The little kind of sketch. That's actually the final bowl in the series. The first bowl in the series is the one on the right. In fact, the people working in the shop with him, when he produced the first bowl, they thought he was done, and he's like, I'm keep going. Right? But that bowl is pretty ubiquitous. That's just like an everyday bowl. That's not a creative bowl. He wanted to get to the Picasso essence of a bowl, the one-line bowl. And it's this kind of pruning away that allowed him to actually make a profoundly creative contribution. And I think this is a good thing to keep in mind, that sometimes we have to do the work of cutting away possibilities. Right? Things that seem strong can actually be weak. Things that seem weak might actually be strong. We have to kind of cut away, weed the garden, and then we can see what's really there. And that's when we can select something and act on it. So to give you a more classroom-based example, let's return to this. And this is an example I often use. I just always go to the well on this one because I think it's a beautiful little example. So imagine that you taught a kid the borrowing strategy. 26 minus 17 is 9, okay? And you taught him how to borrow, okay, so 6 is smaller than 7, so you have to borrow from the 20, blah, blah, blah. And you taught that strategy. And then you set him loose to work on some practice problems. And you ask the class, okay, what did you get? And so one kid says 9, and that's the correct answer. And as a good teacher, you'd say, how did you get 9? And so the child says, I added 3 back to 6 and got 9. Okay, unusual response. Unusual response. You're like, I have this worksheet to get through. You're looking at the dot. Like, okay, so I think most of us would say it's fully justified to say something like, why don't you think about that some more? Can somebody help him out? Right? That's a teacher move. Gentle, killing ideas soft. But sometimes it's justified. Why don't you think about it? Can somebody help him out? He seems confused. But like I said earlier, we don't know if that's confusion, willful distraction, or something more. So, in this particular clip, the teacher taught from a Piagetian approach, a constructivist approach, using just chalk and a chalkboard. And she drew out from her student this response. The kid said, okay, well, here's how I solved this problem. I took the 6 and the 7 and set them aside for a moment. So I had 20 minus 10, right? 20 minus 10 is 10. I take my 7, subtract that from the 10. That gives me 3, add it back to 6, that's 9. Boom. Guess what? That is mathematically accurate. This is a second grader, right? Mathematically accurate, original, creative. Now, the most powerful, beautiful thing about that whole moment is the minute he said that, another child who got 18 as the answer said in public, I disagree with myself now. Right? What a powerful thing to say. I mean, who says that in public? The power of this kid's explanation. Right? This is a creative contribution contributing to the learning of another child. That kid's like, oh, I totally see how you got 9 now. Right? I got 18, but based on this other child's explanation, and the teacher just facilitated that. Right? She pruned away what looked like strong responses, borrowing, and allowed for this kind of response to give strength to what looked like a weak response, to nurture it, just explore it a little bit, and there was and these kind of seemingly bitter roots absolutely bore fruit in this case. All right, so pruning possibilities. The final component is once you've selected something, right, then it's time to take action. So this is like the creative problem-solving thing. So if you're thinking about building your lessons out and you've come up with some ideas, and I encourage you to do this, and this is sometimes the most difficult work. You're like, okay, I'm getting some ideas here, I can revamp some of my lessons, but the next step is you actually have to do something. And in the spirit of Star Wars coming out, there is do or do not, there is no try. Right? And so taking measured action means you actually have to try it out, but do it in a sensible, safe way. Measured action, taking small steps. There's a lot of talk about big data. It's in education as well. But I say there's power in small data. Any of you that wear like Fitbits or Apple Watches or anything like that tracks your steps, there's great power in small data where you can try something out, right? Or you could set a goal and like at the end of the day, that you're under like 1,000 steps. So the next thing you know, you're running up and down the stairs, you're dancing around in the kitchen, you're going to hit that extra 1,000 steps because it's a small goal. It's something attainable, but still something ambitious. So there's power in small data, trying things out. All right, so what does this look like if you were to build projects based on this model? So what I've talked about so far, and this is what I'll close with, is taking your existing curriculum and just making some little tweaks, right? Making these slight adjustments, just introducing opportunities for uncertainty and creativity to emerge. What if you took this kind of model and actually stretched it out and designed projects that could actually make a contribution beyond the walls of the classroom? And so I call these kinds of projects legacy projects. And they're very simple. They're similar in many ways to a lot of project-based learning, design-based learning, but there's a couple, I think, fundamentally important differences. I call them legacy projects because one of the criteria that distinguishes a legacy project is it has a life beyond the project. All right? So kids are generating some kind of artifact or something that lives beyond the life of a project. All right? And so I'll give you an example of one. On those top 2 corners there, those are kids that were presenting on their projects that they did, and I would classify these as legacy projects. So the school district I'm working with outside of Fresno. So in the top right there are 2 girls that are talking about this project where they did this cancer walk and this cancer awareness kind of project. And so you can imagine in their community, there's a lot of materials out there, but a lot of the materials haven't been translated to Spanish, so a lot of their family members can't get the information they need, right? And so kids that have family members that are suffering with cancer and they didn't have awareness about that, they realize that's a problem. So how can we increase awareness? So these kids decided we're going to do this translation project. We're going to translate these materials for people in our community, for family members, and we're going to disseminate these materials, right? And so that's kind of the legacy, that they produce something that lives beyond life of the project. Now, these projects, if you roll back, well, how do you get to that project? Or just ask these questions, very simple but provocative questions. You just ask kids, what is a problem that you're experiencing in school? What's a problem that's facing our community? What's a problem that's facing our nation, our world, right? And then you have them explore, why does it matter? And you don't worry about standards or anything right now. You ask them, what are they wrestling with? I call these complex, authentic problems. They're complex because they're ill-defined, there's no easy solution. They're authentic because the kids are generating them and they mean something to the kids. Like, I have a family member that if there could have been early diagnosis, if she understood self-examination, she maybe wouldn't have had cancer, but she didn't have access to those materials. That's why it matters, right? And so this third question is the powerful question. Once you get kids to be able to articulate the problem, why it matters, then you give them the challenge. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? What are we, this 4th grade class, this 9th grade class, this kindergarten class, going to do about it? And you will be amazed at what kids can do if you pose these kinds of questions. And then finally, what will the lasting contribution be? So there's a variety of these kinds of projects. In the schools I work with in Beijing, one of the schools in Beijing there, they have something where they're concerned about their history and culture kind of being left as the modernization of China is occurring. And so how can they blend kids' interest in modernization and performance with traditional things like dance, different martial arts, calligraphy, writing the characters of the words. And so they were able to put together this legacy project that celebrates both of these things, and then they have an artifact of it. They have a video of that and so on. This school in the corner left there, the kids are talking about putting something together to increase awareness about what kids go through during adolescence and to drop these off in doctors' offices. These kids in the top left are learning about the drought and water conservation and what they can do in their home and community to help how to reduce wastage of water and make a difference. And so it all starts with these kinds of provocative questions, and then you can engage in using that kind of those 4 principles. And so just to show you a couple outcomes that are real, like this kid, a 6th grade kid, he was in a science class, and he was studying about different projects they could do. And one of the things that they were looking at are these orange worms that are pests to nut growing, and they typically give them an almond paste as a bait to kill this pest. And so what he thought of is like, I like pistachios. So he has this kind of personal insight, like, I think they taste better than almonds. Why not use pistachios as the bait? Right? And so in a normal class, might be like, that's a great idea. But what this teacher did is there were connections to UC Davis. And so this kid's dad and another lab scientist at UC Davis say, let's test this out. And sure enough, they found through controlled trials that those pests preferred pistachios. And so this kid's idea then gets out into the world and changes the way they deal with this pest. In the UK, there's a group of kids where one of the kids' dads was a trained neuroscientist, but he wanted kids to experience real science. They did observations of bee behavior, and the teacher's working with this partner, and they had this unshakable sense of possibility thinking. They keep asking, what if we did a real science project? And then lo and behold, they found some interesting anomalous behaviors of these bees that no other scientists that contributes to the literature, right? And so they asked, well, what if we shared this with other scientists and see, is this really something? And sure enough, scientists were like, there's something to this. So then they said, well, what if we try to publish this in a peer-reviewed scientific journal? And so, again, it's asking what if, this possibility thinking. And so they submitted it to a couple of journals. They got soundly rejected. So they kept asking other experts, is there something to this? Can you write support letters around this? They finally submitted it to the editor of Biology Letters. It's a journal of the Royal British Society. It's one of the most premier journals in science. And so the editor agreed to publish this article using hand-drawn tables written in kid speak, no scientific citations, but as long as other scientists would write a couple commentary pieces to provide the science behind it, to contextualize the contribution. Imagine this. These kids, and you can look this up in biology letters, this, the Blackatown Bees is the name of the paper that's published in this peer-reviewed, top-tier biology journal. And it's just about asking what if. What if we do this? Pruning possibilities, insatiable possibility thinking. And kids can do this kind of thing. And who knows what that sparks in a kid? Maybe for the first time in generations, a kid feels like, maybe I can go on and be a scientist, right? Maybe you spark some interest, some identity component. It doesn't have to be huge like that. These can be small, community-based type projects. So what I invite you to do is think about, what if you did this in your own school? What if you posed these questions to students? And then what you find from these kinds of projects is, if you start working on these projects, they are so robust that you can actually load in standards that you cover. So teachers that teach these projects, they take little checkpoints like every week and look back and say, what did we cover? What standards did we actually hit this week? I think one of the things that we've inherited with like the standards-based movement, which just rends out last creative drop of us as educators and our students, and instead replaces it with sawdust in the mouth, is planning lessons with standards first. So taking a set of standards and trying to develop lessons that attain those standards. When you do that, you erase the possibility for this kind of stuff to emerge. If you do something like this, where you do a project that kids care about, you will be amazed at the number of standards you hit. And let's say you're missing some. You're monitoring it, right? You're taking measured action. You might say, okay, we have missed a lot of the language arts standards we need to hit. So then you can maybe step aside and direct teach that. But what I would argue is, if we taught in ways like this, you wouldn't have a kid asking, why do I need to learn perimeter? When you teach in kind of like, let's take the standard, we have to learn about perimeter, let's build a lesson to teach perimeter, what we are doing there is we are using academic subject matter as a means to its own end. So our only justification for that for a kid is, when they ask, why do you need to learn this? We could just say, because you need to learn how to calculate perimeter. Or at best we could say, because it's going to be on the test. Neither of which is compelling to anyone, right? But what if instead you have this project, and you're in this urban area, and there are no green spaces, there are no common spaces, but on the roofs of buildings you can grow gardens to give to the food kitchen, or that you could use fresh produce into your own school lunch program. What if that was the project you're working on, and you have a small team of kids on the roof measuring, and you say, we need to figure out the perimeter of our garden up here. No kid's going to say, why do we need to know perimeter? Because it's embedded in there, right? Because we're making a garden. So I think this kind of flips things. It also requires, all projects require, but these in particular require that kids don't do the same thing the same time in the same way. Everyone can't call the newspaper to put the ad in. We only need 2 of you to do that. 18 of you need to do this, right? So everyone's doing different things, and they're learning to work towards a collective end, something that matters and lasts. And they can come back years later and say, I built this bus shelter with my 4th grade class that used to be dilapidated. We restored this. And the next year, 4th graders comes in, and that's their restoration project. And now we have 3 that we rebuilt. I mean, it just goes on, and you can still meet standards in a very powerful and provocative way. But I would argue it all starts with, replacing the fear of the unknown with curiosity, with an unshakable sense of possibility thinking. That's all I have for you. I'm happy to answer questions, comments, concerns, but thank you all for sitting through my talking. I appreciate it. Any comments, questions, thoughts before I lose my voice? I've been talking a lot today. Yes?
When it comes to fostering like the creativity in the classroom, what really struck me was when you spoke about like the math problem, right?
Right.
And how one student had what seemed to be at the time like an unfathomable path to getting the right answer to that problem, and the student who ultimately had the incorrect answer at 18 was so sure of whatever it was because maybe it's that active approach. So I see obviously the obvious relevance of creativity in the classroom in terms of building culture, so students not only are comfortable sharing their creative approach to something, but also acknowledging at the same time being comfortable and confident just as much to do that as they are to share their,
Yeah. So the question and comment is, which I really appreciate, so how do you establish this culture in your classroom where kids are willing to take the risk to share their ideas, to be wrong, and to learn from each other? So not only to share your own unusual path, but to be willing to say, I disagree with myself. And so it's not like I had him planted here or anything, but I do have a slide that kind of fits this. What I really believe is this. If we really want to create this culture, if we really want to help kids reclaim their own creativity, we have to start with ourselves. I don't think it's fair to ask or require students to take the risks, or our children or the people we coach to take risks, unless we're willing to demonstrate that ourselves. And I think what ends up happening to a lot of kids is they're invited into doing that and they get burned over and over and over again. I mean, it's happening to my daughter, and she's only in 4th grade. She's already been burned multiple times where she's invited to share out one of her ideas and learns that's not the way to share it out. And so I think the way you do that is you demonstrate that you're taking risks, and you make mistakes, but you show how to recover from those, how to learn from it, and how it's okay. That it's okay to not know where this is going, but to trust yourselves to work together. And I think by doing that, demonstrating that, that's the only way you can get there. There's this great phrase, and I don't know who it's attributed to, but I absolutely love. I think one of the mistakes sometimes we make as parents and coaches and adults is we expect kids to respect us. And the idea is, if you want their respect, respect them first. Right? And so it's the same sort of thing. If you want kids to take risks, you need to take risks in your teaching. Right? We need to be willing to fail in front of our students and recover from those failures, and show vulnerability and show strength at the same time, and establish those ground rules. Something that I found that works really well for this is using what if as a stem for evaluative conversations. So saying something that's very pointed, if you put what if in front of it, you can try this in your own personal relationships too. It works pretty well. Instead of saying like, why did you do that? You can say, what if? And you can give pretty direct feedback. Like I said earlier this morning, like you could tell a kid, what if you use punctuation next time you write that? Right? But you teach them how to give feedback to each other. It's just one suggestion. It's one possibility. There's other ways, there's other feedback I can give you. But I think if you preface it with what if, you start building this mindset, this culture of possibility thinking. Right? And then when you approach really difficult problems, you just teach kids to talk using what if, including evaluative talk. So that's the kind of thing that can start building that. And sometimes you have to teach ground rules. Some of us and young people all need to learn how to talk to each other in a way, right? So being explicit, so you can use more or less explicit ground rules depending on the class. But I think using stems like what if is very powerful in this space. So I appreciate that comment. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? I know it's been a long day for you all. I could go on forever for this stuff, but I'm not going to. Professors like to profess. Any other thoughts? Yes?
Mine is a little off topic. You said something about the American Idol and how they seem like an angel.
Oh, yeah.
Around the judges. You said my colleague's working on something with that. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, all right. So, I think this is, when you work, I have some colleagues that it's fun because we just start generating all these ideas. So when my colleagues started exploring, and I bounced this idea of creative mortification off of him first, and then he started seeing my work in that area, and he started thinking about what he calls creative mollification, which is where you essentially are just kind of building a kid up, but you're not teaching them the real world constraints. You're not teaching them it takes this many hours of deliberate practice to become good at this, right? So you're just saying to a kid who still has to put a lot more work in to become a singer that could stand in front of a public audience and sing, but you're not giving them that feedback. You're like, oh no, when you sing, tears come to my eyes, right? And so you're just kind of building them up with no substance, and eventually real world constraints will hit them, and that can be as devastating as hearing something like a creative mortification comment where you're no John Keats. And that can stop a kid from pursuing that as well. That can be very devastating to experience. So it's kind of both ends of that. So again, what we talk about is try to provide this feedback that's honest, and maybe using a what if stem, but also is encouraging, that suggests you could get better, but you have to put the time in. Not to harp on this, but the conversation I've tried to have with my daughter about like mindset, for example, like growth mindset, because she started internalizing that she's not good at math. She's just, And I would always say, yet. That's a great carol. I like that. And it works around the dinner table, but then she goes to school, and that yet part disappears, right? So I think we have to think about different contexts to play different roles. We can say something in this context, but unless it's happening in that context, it's almost like it was never said. So I was trying to help her understand and explore her own thoughts about this by saying, because she kept saying, my friends are just good at math, and I'm not. I'm like, well, how did they get good at math? They're just good at it. I've been in there. I spend the same amount of time in that class as them. They can do it. I can't. Okay? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, stop with the yet. All right. So we started exploring this. I'm like, okay, you are an American Girl doll expert. You really are. Tell me the 2013 American Girl Doll of the Year. She will tell the name, all the accessories, and the picture came out. And it's just like, okay, stop. I understand. You have deep network knowledge about American Girl dolls, which costs a lot of money, by the way. But anyway, so I'm like, so do your friends have that knowledge? They're like, no, not at all. I am like I know you are the American Girl doll expert. So let's talk about this. How is it that they don't know that expertise, but they know math expertise? I put the time in that. I'm like, yes, right? So they put when you're sitting here watching YouTube videos about American Girl, AG channel, hey guys, this is the next American Girl doll accessory, and you're spending all that time building your content, domain knowledge, they're probably doing their math homework, right? And so I think having those kinds of conversations can help, right? So it's not fair to me to say to my daughter, it's okay, you're going to be fine, because she hasn't put the work. She needs to hear, you need to put the work in, and then you'll get better at it. It's not like you have it or you don't. You've put the work in here. If you want to get better at this, you need to put the work in here. Those are difficult conversations, and unless you have those, then you set kids up to get eviscerated in those spaces. Just like happens to, they started phasing that out in American Idol, but the early version of American Idol, half of it was just showing people that, couldn't sing at all, and they just get destroyed by the panels. And it's just a painful thing to watch because of that. And those people thought they could actually sing, but they haven't put the time in yet. Yes?
How would you start a conversation with your administrator that's not yet allowing creativity of their staff? They want everyone on the same page. They want synchronicity across the grade. What do you say in terms of what you're talking about to maybe start more project-based learning?
Yeah, I think one way you can kind of approach that is let them recognize when something isn't working, how important it is to start. I think this possibility thinking is a little bit safer to start thinking about, where you can think about, okay, you don't always have to be creative, right? You don't have to come up with a creative way to take attendance, for example, right? You just take attendance. You don't want to come up with a creative way to, unless the situation dictates itself. So I think you can move into that space and say, find a place that's a target area and it's not working. We've been trying these things, we've been getting PD on them, whatever it is, it's not working. What if we started thinking about a way to move from what we're currently doing to what we could or should be doing? And not in a prescriptive way, but in an exploratory way. Let's explore, let's engage in possibility thinking. I think that's a little bit easier to think about. And then you can start doing some miniature demonstrations. And the thing about these techniques, which is something I heard from one of our old Oregon professors, it meets the interocular traumatic test. Remember that phrase? So when you bring in administration and families and school boards, it meets the interocular traumatic test. You don't have to show them statistics or, standards met or test scores. They see what the kids are doing, and it hits them right between the eyes. And they're like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe what these kids have done. That's the kind of thing. So I think demonstrating with your own kids, so starting small, taking small, reasonable steps, and demonstrating to the power of what the kids are doing themselves, and also encouraging them. If I was glib, I'd say hand them a copy of my book, or better yet, give me that person's address and I'll send them a copy of my book. I don't know if they'll read it, but I think even more powerful than that is seriously to work with kids to demonstrate it. Demonstrate the value. Like I said, it's an empirical question. Raise those questions at a staff meeting. Would our kids learn more? See if you can run that experiment. If we explored one problem 18 different ways versus 18 problems the same way. Start disrupting this kind of culture of sameness, and I think things might start bubbling up. And some administrators are wonderful in coming up with that idea, like, you know what, I think we're doing too much of the same. when you've done all the groundwork, and then they can create that opening. But I agree with you, without leadership opening those doors, a lot of times it's much more difficult. But remember, creativity thrives in constraints. So even if you're feeling totally constrained and isolated, you can still be creative in that space. Contact me. I'll put stuff up here. If you want, I love pursuing this. So if you want me to share things with you, if you want to share stories, if you want feedback, I'd be happy to help. But there's no easy answers to those kinds of questions other than, try taking small steps towards that and demonstrating and see, does it in fact lead to different openings? And I think once people start realizing that, new possibilities occur. Other thoughts? Last parting question? Comment? Disagreement? All right, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. I wish you all well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.